The pen was already in her hand when he spoke. Not loudly. He never did anything loudly. But the words landed in that boardroom the way a single stone lands in still water, quiet at first, then spreading until everything around it had changed shape. Mrs. Hargreaves, I think there's a number you haven't seen. The night had started the way bad nights always do in business, with too many lawyers in a room and not enough oxygen. Sylvia Hargreaves had built Montclair Logistics from a leased warehouse in Brampton and a second-hand truck she'd bought at auction in 2009. 16 years later, Montclair operated 17 distribution centers across Ontario and Quebec, moved contracts worth $400 million a year, and employed close to 900 people. Sylvia had done that. Her and nobody else. She'd missed her daughter's school play the year they won regionals. She'd missed her father's last birthday because she was in Calgary closing a deal. She had paid for this company with the kind of currency you can't get back, which made what was happening on the 14th floor of the Montclair head office on a Tuesday night in March all the more difficult to sit with. The consolidation report was on the table. 3 copies, spiral-bound, tabbed, the product of 6 of forensic accounting by a firm that billed $600 an hour. The numbers were bad, not recoverable. With restructuring bad, just bad. 2 years of rising fuel costs, a logistics contract that had gone sideways in the first quarter, and an acquisition in Laval that had never performed the way the projection said it would. All of it had stacked up into something Sylvia's CFO, a careful man named Bertrand Morel, had described as a structural insolvency event. The bankruptcy papers were on the table, too. Sylvia had read them twice that afternoon. She had read them the way you read a diagnosis, slowly, looking for the word that tells you it's not as bad as it sounds. She hadn't found that word. By 8:15 that evening, the firm's senior partner had walked her through the signing process. It was, he said, the responsible path. Protect the creditors. Honor the obligations. Let the courts manage the dissolution. He said this with the careful tone of a man who understood that the word dissolution meant 16 years of someone's life being organized into line items. Sylvia picked up the pen. The door at the far end of the room opened. His name was Terrence Webb. He was 44 years old, built like a man who had spent decades doing physical work, which he had, and he wore the gray uniform of a building services contractor, which he also wore most nights of the week. He had been cleaning the offices on the 14th floor of the Montclair building for 3 years. He knew which executives left their coffee cups on their desks and which ones washed them out. He knew the layout of every room on that floor the way he knew the layout of the house he rented in Mississauga, not because he'd memorized it, but because he'd moved through it enough times that it had become part of him. He had not intended to walk into a boardroom full of lawyers. He had knocked. The door had been slightly ajar, and he had knocked twice and heard nothing, and he had pushed it open far enough to see the room was occupied. And he had immediately started to back out with the quiet apology that was second nature to a man who had spent 3 years being invisible in other people's offices. But then he had seen the report on the table. Not the whole thing, just the cover page, and one page that had slid out from the bottom of Sylvia's copy, face up on the polished table. He had seen the number, and something in him, something that had been trained a long time ago, in a different life, in a different room, had gone very still. "Mrs. Hargreaves," he said, "I'm sorry for the interruption. I'll come back." Sylvia looked up. She looked the way people look when they've been underwater for a long time and the surface is still further away than it should be. Tired past the point where tiredness feels like anything. "That's fine," she said. "We're almost done here." He nodded. He started to pull the door closed. Then he stopped. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the doorframe, and he had a conversation with himself that no one else in the room could hear. It was the kind of conversation a man has when he knows something, but also knows exactly how it will look when he says it. He was wearing a gray uniform. There were 4 lawyers at that table, and a CFO and a CEO, and none of them were wearing gray uniforms. He had a mop in his cart in the hallway. He had not been invited to say anything. He had also once spent 11 years as a forensic accountant at a firm in Toronto before the 2012 restructuring that had taken his department and 43 jobs along with it. That was before the divorce. Before the custody arrangement that gave him his son every second week and made stable employment in a demanding field a mathematics problem he couldn't solve. Cleaning offices on the night shift paid consistently, and consistently was what his son needed him to be. Nobody in that room knew any of that. He looked at the page again, the number on it. "Mrs. Hargreaves," he said, "I'm very sorry. I don't want to overstep. But I think that figure on page 31 might be doubled." The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. Bertrand Morel was the first person to speak. He had been CFO at Montclair for 6 years, and he was not a man who responded poorly to pressure, but he was also not a man who expected to be questioned by the cleaning staff at 8:20 at night. "I'm sorry," Bertrand said. "Not unkindly, but clearly. This is a private session." "I understand," Terrence said. "I apologize." He pulled the door the rest of the way closed. Sylvia looked at the door for a moment. Then she looked at Bertrand. Then she looked down at the report in front of her, open to page 31. The number was there. It was a large number. It was the number that, more than any other figure in the report, had made the case for insolvency feel airtight. "Bertrand," she said. "Sylvia. What's the source document for the figure on 31? A pause. "The European subsidiary roll-up, and the roll-up pulls from the Q3 consolidation worksheet." Another pause, shorter. "And the Q4 adjustment." Sylvia set the pen down. She walked to the door and opened it. Terrence was in the hallway, pulling his cart toward the next office. He stopped when he heard the door. "Come back in," Sylvia said. "Please." He sat at the table, not at the head of it, not as though he belonged there in any formal sense, but in the chair nearest the door, the way a man sits when he wants to be easy to remove, if removal becomes necessary. One of the lawyers had already started typing something on his laptop. Another had looked at his watch. Sylvia slid the report across to him. "Page 31. Tell me what you see." Terrence looked at it. He looked at it the way he used to look at discrepancy reports. Not scanning, actually reading, following the logic of the numbers the way you follow a trail through a forest. "This line item," he said, pointing. "Montclair European Holdings, Q4 amortized liability." He paused. "It's been included here, in the parent company consolidation." "Yes," Bertrand said carefully, "as it should be. It's also in the subsidiary roll-up on page 28, line 42. Terrence looked up. "It's the same figure. It's been captured twice." Nobody moved. Terrence kept his voice even. He had a very specific memory of what happened when you introduced bad news into a room full of people who had committed to a direction. He had learned years ago that being right about numbers in a room that didn't want you to be right was its own kind of careful work. If you remove the duplicate, he said, the consolidated liability position changes. Not by a small amount. Bertrand was already at his own copy. His finger was moving down page 28. He stopped at line 42. He moved back to page 31. The lawyer who had been typing stopped typing. "That's a different firm's worksheet format," Bertrand said, almost to himself. It wasn't an excuse. It was the sound of a man understanding exactly what had happened. The Laval acquisition had used a different accounting template. When the subsidiary financials had been imported into the parent consolidation, a line that should have been flagged as already captured had been entered as a new liability. 6 weeks of forensic review, and no one had caught it because both numbers were accurate individually. The duplication only appeared when you held both pages in your head at the same time. Terrence had held both pages in his head at the same time, in a hallway, in a gray uniform. In 30 seconds, The room worked through it in silence for the next 40 minutes. Bertrand on the phone with his team, the lawyers with their laptops open. Sylvia standing at the window that looked out over the city, her arms crossed, not talking. Terrence had offered to leave. Sylvia had told him to stay, so he stayed. He sat at the edge of the table and answered the questions that came his way, carefully, accurately, without elaboration. And he did not look at the lawyers when they stopped looking skeptical and started looking at him differently, because that kind of shift in a room was something he had learned not to draw attention to. When people realize they've underestimated you, they can feel embarrassed, and embarrassed people sometimes turn difficult. And Terrence had enough experience with rooms like this to know that the goal was never to be right loudly. The goal was for the right thing to happen. At 9:50, Bertrand set his phone down and looked at Sylvia. Removing the duplicate entry, he said, changes the liability figure by just under $11 million. Sylvia turned from the window. The insolvency threshold, she said, is 10.4, Bertrand said. She stood very still. Outside the window, the city was doing what the city always does, just continuing, indifferent, lit up in orange and white all the way to the lake. Somewhere down there, 900 people were asleep or at home with their families, and none of them knew how close the floor had come to giving way under them tonight. The bankruptcy papers were still on the table. Sylvia walked to the table, picked them up, and placed them face down on the chair beside her. She sat. She looked at Terrence. "Tell me your name," she said. It was a strange request in the sense that she had said his name already, twice, since she'd called him back in from the hallway. But Terrence understood what she was asking. She wasn't asking for his name. She was asking for his story. She was asking how a man in a cleaning uniform ends up being the person who sees what 6 weeks of $600 an hour work failed to see. He told her, not the whole thing, not the divorce or the custody schedule or the specific morning in 2013, when he had cleaned out his desk at the firm and taken the long way home because he wasn't ready for his son to see his face yet. But enough. She listened the way people listen when they've been wrong about something and they're serious about understanding how. His son was named Eli. He was 13, tall for his age, and had recently become interested in what he called the logic of money, which Terrence suspected was either a sign of genuine aptitude or the early symptoms of the same curse that had made Terrence himself incapable of walking past a spreadsheet without reading it. Eli had a science project due on Friday and had texted his father 3 times that evening, the last message arriving at 7:48. "Dad, did you get my notes from the kitchen table? I need them." Terrence had texted back a thumbs up. He was pretty sure he had seen notes on the kitchen table, reasonably sure. He thought about Eli sitting at home, probably still awake, probably having made himself a bowl of cereal, because Terrence had told him there were leftovers in the fridge, but Eli always chose cereal, and he felt the particular low hum of guilt that single parents carry with them everywhere. The knowledge that being somewhere else, even when the somewhere else is necessary, is still being somewhere else. He thought about the school fees coming in April. The overnight trip Eli's class was taking to Ottawa in May. The winter jacket that had lasted 2 seasons longer than it should have. He was not thinking about any of this when Sylvia spoke again. He was thinking about the number on page 31 and whether there were other documents in that package that deserved a second pass. "I'd like you to review the rest of the consolidation report," Sylvia said. "Tonight, if that's possible. Bertrand will stay." Terrence looked at Bertrand. Bertrand gave the careful nod of a man recalibrating. "Tonight is fine," Terrence said. They found nothing else. That was the thing about an error like this one. It was usually singular. A formatting inconsistency that compounded at exactly the wrong moment in exactly the wrong place. The rest of the document was sound, which was either reassuring or maddening depending on how you chose to think about how close they had come. By midnight, Bertrand had contacted the accounting firm. By 12:30, their senior partner, a different one, older, less smooth, had arrived in person. There were conversations that Terrence was not part of and did not expect to be. He had moved his cart further down the hallway and finished the offices he was scheduled for because the building still needed to be clean in the morning, regardless of what was happening in the boardroom. Sylvia found him at 12:50, sitting in the small break room at the end of the hall, drinking the particular brand of bad coffee that office break rooms always have, the kind that has been sitting in the kerfuffle long enough to develop opinions. She sat across from him. "The firm is revising the report," she said. "We'll have a corrected version by end of week. The restructuring options look very different with accurate numbers." He nodded. She looked at her hands for a moment. "I want to ask you something, and you can say no." He waited. "Montclair is going to need a financial controller, a real one, not the contract arrangement we've had. Someone internal, with authority over the consolidation process." She looked up. "I'm not offering you the job tonight. That would be insulting. You'd need to apply. There'd be a process. I'm not the only voice in it. But I'm telling you that if you applied, you would be taken seriously. Completely seriously." Terrence put down his coffee. He looked at the table. There was a ring from someone's mug on the laminate. He noticed these things. He always had. "I'd need to think about the hours," he said finally. "I know. I have a son. I understood that," Sylvia said. "We have a flexibility policy. Bertrand manages 2 kids on his own, 3 days a week. It's not a perfect system, but it's a real one." He looked at her. She didn't look like someone making a charitable gesture. She looked like someone doing math. The practical kind. The kind where you've realized that the person in front of you has something the organization needs, and the only sensible thing is to stop pretending otherwise. "I'd need to think about it," he said again. "Not stalling, actually thinking." "That's reasonable," Sylvia said. She stood up. "What's your son's name?" "Ellie." She nodded. "The Ottawa trip in May, the school trip." She said it the way people say things when they're not entirely sure why they're saying them. "Montclair has a family support fund, employees and dependents. It's not a large amount, but it covers things like that." Terrence looked at her. "I haven't taken the job yet," he said. "No," she said, "but you saved it. 16 years of it, all 900 of them." She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. "The fund is there whether you take the job or not. It's the least I can do, and I've never been very interested in doing the least." She left. Terrence sat for another few minutes in the break room with the bad coffee and the laminate table, and the particular silence of an office building after midnight, when the work is done and the people are gone, and the whole structure just sits there being what it is, walls and windows and a roof over someone's effort. He picked up his phone and looked at Eli's messages. He typed back, "Notes are on the counter by the microwave. I moved them so the cat wouldn't sit on them. See you Friday." He thought about that for a second, then added, "You might want to start packing for Ottawa." He put the phone in his pocket and stood up. He had 3 more offices to finish before his shift was done. He had always finished his shifts. That was not a small thing, even if no one had ever thought to say so. He took his cart and walked back down the hall, and the building held its quiet around him the way buildings do. Without acknowledgement, without ceremony, just the fact of the structure itself, standing because enough of the right things had been put in the right places. There are rooms in this world designed to keep certain people out. You know the ones: the good chairs, the closed doors, the table where the decisions get made. Most people spend their whole lives learning to stay on the correct side of those doors, to be useful in ways that don't ask too much of the people inside. Terrence Webb had done that for 3 years. On the 14th floor of a building he understood better than anyone in it. And on a Tuesday night in March, holding a mop handle, and a decade of knowledge that nobody had thought to ask about, he walked through one of those doors anyway. Not because he forgot the rules, because he had read the number and the number was wrong, and some things matter more than where you're supposed to stand. That's what Eli's father did. That's the kind of man he was raising his son to recognize.